The weather outside is frightful, but it's delightful here beside the fire in the Great Hall on Lard Island. And here we are again having a look at another window. Let's have a look inside, right. Remember the 9th of December, as I think somebody once said. Right, Richard. Size of armies. How have your armies and forces used in your war games changed over the years, and why? Okay, well, I guess, like all of us, my wargaming journey has seen me meander from project to project over the years, and each one presents me with a potentially new idea of what I want from a game, and consequently what forces I need. Being from the Airfix generation, my first armies were, quite predictably, plastic ACW, used with the Bruce Quarry Airfix Guide Napoleonic rules, published by Patrick Stevens. They later came out with an ACW set of rules, which I switched to, but that was only briefly, because I'd been waiting for years for the ACW one to come out, and by the time they arrived, I don't know what I was doing. I think my life had moved to a point where I wasn't doing a lot of gaming in my mid to late teens. So by the time they came out, I kind of was putting the figures on the shelf and didn't really game ACW again until many years later in a very different format and style with sharp practice. Those first armies, plastic, all one side all in blue and the other side all in grey. I wasn't very imaginative, and I don't think I had many resources in terms of telling me what they should have looked like. They were very traditional in that they were regiments and brigades. Each figure, I think, was 33 men in the rules, and the casualty removal system was about actually noting down losses for each regiment until you got to a multiple of 33, and then you removed that many figures from the unit. So if you took 66 casualties, you'd take 2 figures off. The games I played were inspired by the books that I'd seen up till that point, really by authors like Don Featherstone and Tony Bath and Charles Grant. And the table was populated with variations of the 3 main buildings that were the sub-buildings from the Waterloo farmhouse that Airfix produced. Because in those days, you were really limited to just a few buildings that were available. And either for the few buildings that Airfix did for wargaming or for model railways. So I remember there was a big half-timbered manor house, and there was a farmhouse with a very yellow plastic thatched roof that I actually painted in a gloss yellow because it was the only yellow I had. In many ways, these games were hugely old school. They weren't as old school as some of the stuff that R. Henry does, but they were definitely old school. But they kept me amused, and appropriately enough, I was at school. So it was affordable, and my bedroom carpet was conveniently a sort of grass green colour. So who needed a table? My first metal armies, which I guess in those days I considered my first proper armies, because the hobby press was very hot, or one magazine of it at the time, very hot on telling us that plastics were a bit naff. And we really should be playing with metals because it was definitely a serious hobby, and playing with plastics made us look very childish. My pocket money certainly couldn't stretch to 25mm, and they really were 25mm, not the 28mm that we see today. So I bought some 15mm ECW figures from Minifigs. 15mm was quite a new thing then, and I remember that 15mm minifigs at that time were sold in strips of figures, one man behind the other in a file. So how many you got depended on how they cut up this lead strip when they put it in the packaging. And I think I actually painted them while they were still on those strips before snipping the hugely thick lead base. and mounting them on card, which I then painted lime green. In those days, nobody really textured bases, and certainly we didn't have things like clumps to add to them. So they were a really green carpet, green cardboard base, and we were quite happy with that at the time. The armies, the rules that I was using then were Airfix Guide as well. I think they were just a default position, really, especially when you were a schoolboy. They were by George Gush and Martin Windrow. George Gush, of course, wrote the really well-known WRG Renaissance rules. I'm not honestly sure who Martin Windrow is, and I apologise to him if he's listening. And extraordinarily famous, but it hasn't really crossed my path since. Again, a very old-school setup, very traditional, large battles. I think my generation just assumed that wargaming was about big battles, and that was very much the focus of the books that were available and the magazine articles that there were. That said, I do recall attending a model engineer exhibition at Wembley, at the Wembley Conference Centre, when I was about 12, and seeing a 54mm Wild West skirmish game, which blew my mind. They were using Timpo figures, which every schoolboy had Timpo figures in those days. Schoolgirls didn't so much, but I'm sure some did, and they would be a welcome addition. But these Timpo figures had been made into proper grown-up wargaming models because they had cast metal weapons added to them, and that kind of gave them a really cool feel. And the buildings were made from card and balsa, but they looked amazing way back then. I think they were done with a sort of sepia ink wash to get that very brown, woody colour that we used to paint anything wooden brown in those days. It looks like an advert for Cuprinel doing your garden fence panels. But again, these hand-built buildings in a whole Wild West town in 54mm were absolutely amazing. I think by the end of the participation game, my figure had pretty much walked down an alley about 6 inches and had unbuttoned my holster, and I was about to draw my 6-shooter when the umpire called end of play and stumps were pulled, and that was that. But it was remarkable for a youngster whose only gaming experiences were solo, getting an opportunity to sit round a table with other people and look on in awe while they did things rather more exciting than what I was doing. But I guess my wargaming career really took off in 1981 when several stars aligned and changed my life completely. After years of enforced solo gaming, I attended the inaugural meeting of the local War Games Club. It's actually the club we still go to, although it's not a club anymore. We declubbed, just to avoid all the political bollocks that you get with clubs. I also got my first flat. I was 18 years old and got a mortgage, which my kids find quite horrific to think about, but so I had lots of space. I didn't have much furniture, so I had loads of space to fill with wargaming stuff. And almost simultaneously, as if by magic, Miniature Wargaming magazine was launched with photos of amazing ranges of figures that I'd simply not seen before. And it really was a window on a completely new universe, or universe I hadn't really been aware existed. And Essex miniatures were the big revelation. This was even, Essex were the foundry before foundry existed. And I built up several retinues of medieval knights and all their relevant supporters. An article on medieval naval gaming, of all things, really took my fancy. I think largely due to the bizarre tactic of placing an anvil in the crow's nest, and if the enemy came close, you'd hurl it onto the neighbouring ship when they came close, and it would crash through the deck and right through the hull and sink them, which I guess is the most primitive of broadsides. I bought an 8 by sheet 8x4 sheet of marine ply, which once I got it outside the wood merchants, I realised didn't fit in the car. So I had to borrow a saw and cut it up into more manageable sizes. But anyway, I guess marine ply was suitable because I built a whole fleet of medieval cogs and caravels with their castles fore and aft and packed them with 25mm soldiers. And looking back at the space limitations on the ships, probably meant this was my first large skirmish game with, 20 figures on a ship, and a few of them would be archers. Let's say 4 of them would be archers, and a few of them would be knights. It would be the knight himself, the leader of the faction, maybe a son or two, and then his sergeants, and then more of a rabble supporting him after that. So it was, if you look at the forces in Dux Britanniarum, I guess it wouldn't be that different to that. But I wasn't really thinking about it in that respect at that time. And it didn't make me a convert to the smaller gamings. I mean, one of my biggest projects at that time, again, was in 15mm. And that was massing huge forces for the wars of the mid-19th century. The Franco-Prussian War, the Austro-Prussian War, the Franco-Austrian War of 1859, Garibaldi in Italy, all that Mittel Europa stuff. Whole armies with multiple corps were laboriously built up over many years. And I think that was the moment for me when it became clear that huge projects really weren't inspiring me. They took years to produce. And then, when we got them on the table, the mega games that emerged were simply unplayable on a club evening. What was more, the huge games often felt quite samey for me. If you're handling a corps in the Franco-Prussian War, it's not that different from handling a corps in the American Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars. And I decided that what I was missing out on was the small tactical detail which really interests me and made each conflict so unique. And having read some accounts of small brigade-size actions in France in the winter of 1870 to 71, I decided to recreate those actions using my 15mm collection, but fielding battalions of 96 figures each, which even in 15mm is pretty impressive. And this really allowed us to focus on the detail that I was looking for. A Prussian 24-figure company was still a big unit on the table. And within that, I could decide how many men remained formed up and how many were committed to the skirmishing firing line. And added to that, I really decided I wanted and I needed to get games that fitted into the 3-hour maximum window that I was gaming each week on the club night. They had to be, playable and deliverable in that time. I also realised that I wanted games that could go from conception to delivery on the table in a modest time frame. And I'm really talking about a month maximum. Like all gamers, I tend to flip from one project to another, and that gets worse when a project loses its initial burning zeal and becomes mundane. I wanted to avoid the mundane by getting the game onto the table while the enthusiasm was still there. Once we'd had that first game, the enthusiasm would, of course, grow, and I could then add more units to my collection. My first step down really came, in terms of size, came with I Ain't Been Shot Mum company-level games for World War II. Again, I did that in 15mm. And I think in about 2006, I was approached and asked if we could write a version of I Ain't Been Shot Mum for a platoon-level game, which was Troops, Weapons and Tactics. And at that point, I shifted to 28mm. At the time, Simon Barger and Paul Hicks had just founded Bolt Action Miniatures. And the sheer beauty of the early Paul Hicks sculpts really caught my eye. And I've been primarily a 28mm gamer ever since, and the shift to smaller games has allowed me to scratch many itches that I never thought I would scratch. I'd always wanted to game Napoleonics as a youngster, but painting acres of Airfix yellow plastic men really was too alarming for me to even think about starting. The ability to paint 6 figures and get a game on the table that I really enjoyed just works for me. However, that's not to say my gaming is exclusively 28mm and exclusively skirmish. I still game huge battles, but now I tend to play that level of game on the Kriegspiel map. I've always loved old maps, and I've got a modest collection in the library here on Lard Island, so getting a chance to play games on those is, I find, just charming, really. Some of the best campaigns we played were using some British Army GSGS maps of the Western Front from the period. To game on those maps that we used at the time really gave us the connection to the history, and what's more, it certainly ticks that box in terms of getting the game on the table. It's much more easy to paint your armies when all you need to do is design some nice blocks in PowerPoint or Photoshop and then copy and paste until you've got all the battalions and brigades that you need, and you can get gaming straight away. Wargaming is a great hobby for many reasons, and we all know them. I don't need to rehearse them here because you've heard me say them often enough. But for me, the best aspect is that there are no rules on how we should do it. I've got friends who love huge games, and that really works for them. I now prefer the smaller tabletop games as they suit my smaller attention span and my motivation levels. But I like to do my big games on maps. That just works for me. It's truly a hobby where we can all find our own magical spot.